We'll move to item 9. Welcome Phil and Ross for some good news. We have had this recently, so I'll pass over to Ross. Phil and Ross, thank you very much for the Chief Executive and Group Chief Financial Officer update.
Thank you, Your Worship. Morena, councillors. No recovery report today, reason being that there is one on your TRIC committee agenda next week, which has the update material on progress with buyouts and so forth. I want to acknowledge that 2 days ago, in fact it ran over 2 days, we ran a reasonably full-scale emergency management exercise internally to test the changed systems and recognise the fact that we've trained several hundred people in emergency management response in the last year. But of course that's slightly academic if you don't test yourself in terms of what it looks like, albeit in a simulation. So that was very good. Some learnings from that will serve us well. I do note, when I say it was a fairly fulsome exercise, we did activate civil defence evacuation sites. We did model the communications and the declaring of an emergency. So it was fulsome. So I'm very pleased with that. I do draw your attention to the fact that there is a briefing for yourselves on the 9th of December. I'm told that not many councillors have registered or accepted that invitation. I'm drawing it to your attention because we want you to be fully appraised of what the Met Service is telling us about weather patterns over the summer, likelihood of cyclone events, and some stuff to do with our preparedness around that. So I really do encourage people to engage. As I've said to you before, I'm significantly motivated by de-risking this area and making sure that we're in a good position to respond, and that of course includes yourselves. I want to note media in relation to water supply and water care, and draw your attention to an email to yourselves at 7:40 last night, which gives you a briefing about the story that's running around arsenic levels in the water. I wanted just as an aside to note a discussion that Councillor Williamson and I had. I'm very mindful that you get a lot of email traffic, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to distinguish between the routine and the things that are critical to brief you on. So we're implementing a different system, and I'm calling it a code orange. We will in the future try and identify the few really critical things that we think will play in the media and which you need to be across. So I just use that by way of an example for what that might look like going forward, so it doesn't get lost in the morass of communications. But it is important, and we'll get Watercare to follow up post this with any questions you have. I'm not really in a position to answer them, except to hopefully provide a little bit of reassurance that this relates to the Waikato water supply only. There is one reading which was very marginally above the tolerance levels here. There have subsequently been 2 further tests in 2 subsequent days that are below the threshold and safe. Of course, there are precautions still applying, such that the Waikato water supply has been dialed back a bit and the Hunua water supply dialed up. The effect, of course, is that we can confidently tell the public of Auckland that the water is safe. So I'll leave that there. This was acknowledged earlier, but I do want to further acknowledge the fact of the prosecution of the previous chief executive of the port company in Judge Bonner's decision. I've had an initial briefing about that. We will make sure that there is a summary, a briefing for you sent shortly. I think I won't reflect particularly on the port. Other than, the reason I mention it partly now is that it does serve as a reminder of the seriousness of accountability in this space. It's a continual work on for us in terms of our health and safety response, and thank you to Councillor Bartley for addressing some of our health and safety folk as part of our ongoing attention to this. We have recently had a reset in our own health and safety function, and it's coming along well, but something we need to continue to be vigilant of. And it is important that I remind you reasonably regularly that while you have some personal protections in the legislation in terms of health and safety liability, given your governance roles, you're not fully insulated, and there are responsibilities that you have that I need to support you with in the health and safety space. We can return to that at a later time. I want to give you the briefest of updates about the Auckland Future Fund implementation. We are close to having the final draft of the local bill ready for public notification, and that notification process is intended to start next week, meaning that it'll take about 3 weeks and be concluded before Christmas. And following that, and there has been ongoing work with the officers of the Clerk of the House, following that, it's expected that we should be able to finalise all of the steps in order that the bill be introduced to Parliament, hopefully at the first sitting date in the new year. So good progress there. In terms of service performance, really things are either in a stable or growing and improving space. Stable for the most part. I've mentioned this before, but leisure, pools and leisure services up 15% year on year. That trend continues. Customer satisfaction pretty stable, a 6% increase in the waste solutions area. Obviously that's a service that touches a very large number of people in the region, so we monitor that quite carefully. Resource consents down 4% year on year. Building consents also down 4% year on year. But to illustrate the shorter term trend, building consents up 10% month on month. Okay, so a recovering situation in terms of development activity. Financially, and Ross can address the detail of this, net direct expenditure $40 million favourable to this point in the year, 26 million favourable in terms of revenue, $14 million favourable in terms of expenditure. So a good situation. Capital spend 86% of budget if you exclude the Category 3 buyouts, somewhat under more pressure than that because of the number of the extent of buyout activity at the moment is putting pressure on the capital budget. But of course, that's not necessarily a trend that continues for the balance of the year, although I think Ross will talk to you about the pressure that exists from the fact of the number of potential buyouts being higher than what was forecast. I think Ross is also going to mention the savings which are on track. Very finally, and just to take the Mayor up on his invitation around good news, I acknowledge we're a party to a grouping of large employers that have graduate and development programs. We have won an award for the best employer in that regard and the best candidate experience. So that graduate program's come along really nicely. I mentioned to you previously that we were now at 50 graduates in the new year with the intake. In the next cycle, we will be at 75 graduates. So the building of talent pipelines in the organisation is coming along really well. The Recovery Office also has won an award in the Emergency Management Awards for the communications and engagement program around recovery. Obviously, it doesn't escape any of us that they work in a pretty challenging environment, and we're not going to keep everyone happy. There's significant, ongoing distress for people affected by this, but they have done a very good job in terms of engagement and communication, and that's been recognised in those awards. Neil McGowan, our General Manager of Technology in the organisation, also won the top leadership prize for the techies in the local government sphere recently, so that's good acknowledgement for his leadership in that space. And very finally, and this is very local, the Birkenhead Volunteer Fire Brigade named one of our staff, Brandy Stefano, as being their firefighter of the year. So I just mention that because, of course, there are a lot of staff who have voluntary community efforts outside of their day job. So, nice illustration of that.
And just, if I can interrupt just at the end there, Phil, another volunteer Birkenhead firefighter, Ben Halliwell, who many of us know, broke his leg last week fighting fire for the Birkenhead down one of our reserves. So, and he's still working the day after for water care. So, thanks.
We might have to generate a prize especially for him.
Thank you for that, Phil. We'll move to Ross, but I can say yesterday Adam took me around the emergency management exercise. It was quite surprisingly large, and I was able to check and meet the other Wayne Brown, and they do have the right phone number. So that's a great leap forward this time, so it was good. Okay, Ross.
Okay, thank you. So Phil's talked about the numbers for Auckland Council organisation. At a group level, I guess a similar kind of story. Pretty reasonably strong capital delivery, 92% CapEx delivery year to date through the end of October. So it's about $1.25 billion of CapEx delivered to that point. But about 100 million or so less than budget, and that's mainly because Watercare got off to a bit of a slow start with some of their pipe and plant renewals, and Auckland Transport paused some projects as they worked through the NLTP funding issues that have now been resolved. So that program should accelerate a little bit. And that has that has got some strong property buyouts included in those numbers as well, boosting the group results. In terms of projects delivered in October, lots of flood recovery repairs, particularly the transport repairs. 3 slips repaired on Whiru Road, Grand Beach Road, and Takahe Road. Balustrades and two retaining walls on Scenic Drive and Titirangi. And the water space, the relining of the Araki main sewer is now complete in October. So good to get through that milestone, and obviously many other projects as well. So that's the CapEx for the group. In the OPEX space, the numbers are looking good for the current year. About 100 million favourable on a net direct basis. We're seeing group revenue 5% ahead of budget, and direct expenditure 5% favourable to budget as well. So within that, in the parent, it's mainly around higher consenting activity. Also then across the group, higher water and wastewater revenue, and more revenue through the port, through higher container volumes and favourable bulk cargo as well through the port. IGC, Watercare's IGCs continue to be favourable to budget. On the expense side, mainly less spending on repairs and maintenance. Some of that relates to delays with some of the making space for water enhancements been put in place. There's lower professional fees, some of which relates to capital projects, and then employee benefits were lower than budget, mainly driven to some unplanned vacancies and vacancies not being filled as expected. Phil's talked about the parent numbers, 85% CapEx delivery year to date, and 40 million favourable on the OPEX. It's mainly a revenue story there. For the Auckland Council organisation, cost was 2% below budget, but revenue was 17% favourable, which is just those strong regulatory consenting revenues coming through. So those are kind of the numbers for the current year. Recently, we gave a full savings update through to the Rev Committee that identified that this year we're reporting against a $66 million target. Those are the savings from the last annual plan and the long-term plan. That builds on top of 90 million of savings from the last long-term plan, which is permanent ongoing savings that are achieved, which builds on a bunch of other savings all the way through to amalgamation. But the amount that we're kind of chasing and trying to bid in that's over and above all of the existing costs that have come out is 66 million. We reported to the Rev Committee that we've achieved, after 1 quarter of the year, we've achieved 48% of those savings. So around 32 million out of the 66 million has been locked in year to date. So work progresses on the rest of it. It's always challenging. The hard bit is some of the savings are one-off. And the savings compound each year. So for the annual budget year, it's a higher number, and in the year again, it increases as well. So it's a tough savings challenge, but we're making good progress so far. In terms of the annual budget, so we're in the process, as you'll all be aware, is we've kind of now got a draft mayoral proposal. We're working towards decisions on items for consultation for the Budget Committee in early December. We'll be asked to what you want to consult on there, and there'll be other items, including that draft mayoral proposal around CCO reform, which will kind of have different processes and decision making around it. But in terms of the annual budget, there is, alongside the draft mayoral proposal, there's a big pack of staff advice. Largely mirrors what's been provided through the workshops to the Budget Committee. In that, it does detail out, what the budget projections are looking like. By and large, things are the inflation, interest trends, and cost trajectories are generally on track with the projections in the long-term plan. It's a very different picture to previous financial years where there's budget holes of $200-300 million. But there are some pressures in there and risks that have been monitored. That the numbers we have in there talk about a sort of a $10 million budget gap for Auckland Council that we're working through. Still lots of pluses and minuses, but we're sort of starting with a 10 million gap, and there's lots of other pressures. Phil's talked about the buyout, so I won't go into detail. You'll begin the full report on that going to the TRIC committee early next month, but it is going to mean more property buyouts. We're already seeing that, and so that means potentially moving money from some of the longer term infrastructure stuff into buying properties now, which means more money going out earlier, which means higher interest costs. So there will be sort of impacts on the annual budget that we'll just have to wait and see exactly where those numbers land, but there will be extra interest pressures impacting next year's budget, depending on exactly where all those numbers land. There's a number of pressures within Auckland Council. There is things around energy costs. There are things like some decisions made around the pools and levers contract, and including the living wage has got a bit of pressure in there. So there's a number of things being worked through. Auckland Transport, through this process has raised a number of different pressures. Some of that's PT patronage and revenue. They've seen good recovery post-COVID, but there's lots of risk and uncertainty around where do those PT revenue numbers go. what is the impact of disruption, what is long-term, what are the long-term behavioural trends in terms of PCSs. So they're just highlighting that there's risk around PT revenue. They've also highlighted risk around New Zealand Transport Agency funding, particularly some around public transport services. So there's some business cases that would need to be approved and endorsed and money flowing in order to get planned new PT services in place. There is parking and enforcement revenue, bit of a risk. The big risk there is, people, stop breaking the rules. People change their behaviour. We don't get to penalise them, which is great in terms of managing the network, but it does have a financial impact. There's risks around track access charges, and there's risks around changes to the ferry program and what that means for operating costs going forward. So quite a long list of Auckland transport risks and other risks across the group. There is the issue around the 7 million for events funding that you're working through as part of the annual budget, and many other pressures, costs, etc. So at the moment, we're kind of saying, looking at all those things, there's no massive budget hole that you need to solve. There's no kind of compelling reason why right now you need to go and tell Aucklanders we can't achieve necessarily a 5.8% rates increase for next year. But we're saying there's lots of risk there. There's lots of things to work through, and lots of things that could mean there is extra pressure. So our advice in those budget papers is that you need to maintain flexibility. We want to, I guess, highlight in the consultation that here's a budget, but there's some risks, and there might need to be some adjustments. The intention is a 5.8% rate increase, deliver all the things in the LTP, but we've got some challenges to work through. We might need to adjust some services, some capex, and the last cab off the ranks is always, do we need to adjust rates? So that means we've got to have that flexibility. We also need to be have restraint. It's kind of quite easy to look at one of those pieces in isolation and just go, well, we could do a small 0.2, 0.3% rates rise for this piece, for some for a transport piece, or for the events funding. But if you add up a bunch of small increases, could add up to a number where we're suddenly heading towards a double-digit rate increase. So we just want to paint a picture that there are lots of risks and pressures. We're not out of the woods yet. We will do, as a finance team, a full budget refresh across the group in February, and we'll come through and report to you in March, so post-consultation, a full update around how things are looking like. But we just want to highlight, there is risk, there is pressure. It's not all, risk-free. So that's the update for me. I'll pass across to Gary.
Thank you, Ross. Good morning and kia ora koutou. I'll begin with an update on the city centre, as you've requested. The latest data on the city centre foot traffic and retail spending continues the pattern we've seen since March of being lower than for the same month last year, month on month, year to year. So pedestrian counts for October were down 3.2% on October last year. Retail spending in the city centre for September was down 5.8% on September last year. And then alongside that, the guest nights for the region as a whole are also down 5.1%. So this really reflects the fact that higher interest rates have dampened consumer spending this year among Auckland residents and also among potential visitors to Auckland too. The city centre is more sensitive to that pullback in spending as its retail offering is more weighted to discretionary items such as hospitality and accommodation rather than those everyday essentials around groceries and fuel. In the near term, of course, we're entering a season where spending on retail and hospitality usually increases, and the question is whether that will match the strong seasonal upswing that we saw last year. Let's hope it does. Stepping back just to look at the broader economic context, yesterday many of you will be aware the Reserve Bank cut official cash rate by 50 basis points from 4.75 to 4.25, and that's the third cut in a row off the recent high of 5.5% with those earlier cuts in August and October. And the Reserve Bank has the confidence to do this because of the decline in economic activity that's contributed to lower inflationary pressures through the economy. Last month, Stats NZ reported CPI inflation for the year to September was at 2.2%, so that's back within the Reserve Bank's policy target band of 1 to 3%, and that's the first time since the middle of 2021. So the cut was largely expected, and several commercial banks have responded with cuts in the mortgage rates there, and they've also got commensurate cuts in interest rates on savings, of course. Looking ahead, inflation is expected to remain within the target band. and consumer demand is expected to recover over 2025. Of course, subject to that time lag, as households that are on fixed mortgages take some time to roll off and refix to lower rates, which would ease the pressure on their budgets. Recovery for businesses that are exposed to that change in household spending will come after that. In the context of that lower cost of finance, we can expect demand for housing is likely to strengthen. So far, house prices have been relatively flat still, following the sharp corrections that we saw earlier. And so they've been sitting around, the median house price anyway in Auckland's been sitting around $1 million. Of note, requests to Auckland Council for LIM reports have been higher in recent months compared with the same month last year, as have recent building consent volumes, as the Chief Executive noted. On the upside, there's a healthy pipeline of building consents for new homes sitting out there, with our best estimate of being 15 to 20,000 consents for new homes consented but not yet begun construction. So that should mean the housing supply is well placed to respond to the pickup in demand in the near term. The next review of the official cash rates in February, and the Reserve Bank has indicated that if conditions continue to evolve as they've projected, they expect to be able to lower the official cash rate further next year. But they do emphasise that the outlook remains uncertain. Thank you.
I've got a question for you, and then I'll go to the others. But could we have the published? There's data put out each month about the region or across our region of what this retail movements are from various place to place. You've just given us the CBD, but I know that yesterday it was quoted to me that Takapuna's up 9%, Otahu's up about 2 or 3. It's patchy. So rather, and we are the whole city, so can we have you publish a more reflective across the districts, how we're going, so people can see within their own area of councillors what's happening? Is it, you can't infer that CBD across the entire district.
Thank you, Your Worship. I can look into that. At the moment, we receive on a monthly basis the city centre and the region. We had previously received some of the other major centres, the metropolitan centres and some of the town centres. I think we might have foregone some of that data in terms of just trying to think about the value for money we get for these data requests, but we can look into it in terms of if you've got an interest in those other centres and get you at that wider set back again. We'll look into that. So, no.
I think Centrix produce it. Okay, so if you could publish Centrix, that'd be good. Councillor Sayers, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for those updates. I do have a question, but just a quick observation, I guess, around the facts. I guess the financial reporting's indicating, no red flags, but that doesn't mean there isn't lots of pressures there. And I just want to acknowledge the one around the cost savings, around that 60+ million, and within 1 quarter being almost 50% of the way there. That's quite phenomenal. But I think we all realise that, to achieve the whole lot, it's a hard game. And I just want to mention, in terms of acknowledgement, probably through you, Phil, about ongoing efforts that's being made there, and that's a good news story. My question, Phil, is around just trying to understand around the exercise that you did around civil defence and emergency management. I just want to feel if that went out. If I put this in context, when we had the cyclone, particularly in those rural areas, since then they've resourced up with blankets and generators and particularly radios. And I think one of the weaknesses that was experienced is that the communications weren't available. And I understood there's also a relay centre at Northcote too that wasn't manned at the time, so the radio calls couldn't get through anyway. So did the exercise extend to those community response groups, I think they're called, that now have the radios so they can communicate back to the central headquarters during that? Was that part of the exercise? And if not, would it be part of another one?
Councillor, I'll have to check the detail. It was broad, and certainly not only the urban areas there are elements of this that are desktop and elements that we put into practice to test in reality, and there was a broad spread around the region, including some footprint in the rural areas. You're right, to acknowledge I don't know the total number, but we've got supplies to deal with the communications and other welfare support to civil defence centres on quite an impressive scale, all packaged up, all stored, and ready to roll out when needed. So, and yes, it does include some communications capability. We've also, I don't know if councillors have seen these, we've also got, I think, 3 mobile command centres now, exactly to deal with that scenario where we need a local coordination ability out around the region that might be struggling for communication, so satellite internet, etc., etc. So we're in a much better position than we were, and it does include the ready response groups that I think you're referencing, being in the loop with that, and we've established another one of those out south now to try and get a bit more regional coverage. So I'll catch up with you offline, councillor, and fill you in.
Deputy Mayor, please.
Thanks, Your Worship. Look, I just want to congratulate the 3 of you on the positive points that you've raised, including the savings target, noting that the past 3 financial years we get to almost close to $500 million, so well done. I want to talk to you, Phil, though, about what we put in print versus what we hear, because a whole lot of my questions I had around this report, you answered when you spoke to us. But when you get, and I had the same question around the mayor. Retail spend for Auckland was down 5.8%. Well, I recently went to the Newmarket Business Awards and they were quite positive. So I just think some qualification around what that looks like. So when there isn't good news, for example, new dwellings consented going down about almost 20%, 19%, maybe if you could, in the report, from a quality advice, just put some contextualization around that. You speak to it beautifully, but I know all the 5 people that are watching online, might not always get that context. And when people go back to see things, they tend to look at the printed version. So that was just a suggestion, if I may, through you, Phil, because I look at the city centre pedestrian counts and I think to myself, actually, was that really because we had FIFA on and they were a bit higher last time, so therefore they're a bit lower? So just to look at some contextualisation, I think would be helpful on the negatives, all right? Love the positives, keep them coming, but are the negatives really, really bad, or are they because something else happened in that context? Thank you.
The answer? Okay, happy. I was just so quick and quiet.
Long question, short answer, isn't that what you want?
No, that's very good. Righto, we'll try if we can get round the other way now. Short question, long answer from Councillor Foley, please. Councillor Foley? You're neither there in sound or sight. We'll go to Councillor Turner, who's definitely here.
Thank you. I may have missed. When do we do a revaluation on properties values for the rate setting? When does that date of that come around? And do we have a prediction on what we think the movement will be?
So we don't like to speculate. So the property revaluation work is underway, so it has been underway for some time. The revaluation date was 1 May this year, and so we've gone away and we've done a lot of work and created valuations. That has to go through a process with the Valuer General. So we've been through that process. The Valuer General's come back and said, some parts of the city, they're looking really good. Other parts of the city, some further work is required to make sure that we are consistently and accurately applying values, between properties in a consistent way because we use it to share rates. And so the team is now going back and reworking and following up on all that extra work, and it'll come back in the new year. It'll go through a second process with the Valuer General, and it'll be out in the first half of next year. It'll go out to ratepayers. They'll get a notice of what the values are, and then that'll be used to inform rates next year. Obviously, just in terms of the property cycle, property values are lower now than they were 3 years ago. So it's definitely, for most properties, it will be a decrease. That doesn't mean that people's rates go down. It just means the average is down. What really matters is how individual properties move compared to what the average property has done.
Thank you. So, Mayor, on the back of the Deputy Mayor, I personally would like it as simple as it can be made to be explainable, because people don't see the difference between a rate increase and property values causing it's all going up or not often down. So that's going to be important for us and them. Thank you.
Okay. We will do our best on the comms front there.
Okay, Councillor Newman. I've got Newman, Ferry, Leone, Lee, Foley and Hills.
Thank you very much. My question to the officers, I've got two questions. Firstly, about water care, and secondly, in relation to fear of funding. I'm just wondering, with respect to the update report, and it's not addressed here, we could address it in item 10. Have you, in relation to the financial settings and projections moving forward, given consideration to what we're starting to see with water care with respect to their inability to enable growth and development in certain locations because of effectively red zoning choke points on the network, compromising the ability to be able to give effect to these consented developments, and what impact does any mitigation likely to have on the cost of the council organisation? This is going to be a significant issue moving forward, because there is a significant constraint on people's ability to realise what they aspire to achieve in terms of development outcomes.
That's not something that we've had recent updates on. There will be, we've had some preliminary numbers through from water care, and we'll get further numbers through to feed into the group picture for the final budget. To some extent, from a group perspective, that won't affect council debt going forward because of the separation, but we'll still need that information. Water care will need to feed that into their business plans, and that will feed into the economic regulation. It may mean that the the IGCs, which are going well above budget at the moment, there might be a bit less IGCs as people can't connect because of some of these constraints. The bigger picture bit around, well, what is the infrastructure required to overcome those constraints? That is quite a big strategic piece that will have to be worked through with water care, through their asset management plan, their business plans within that new framework of economic regulation.
Can I ask what sort of timing you would give for that work? Because what we have is red zoning now, and the quantum of red zoning is substantial and likely to increase given choke points on that network. I just am a little incredulous as to what we are starting to find out, but we don't really seem to be grappling that in terms of the advice, because it has a material impact on the operating performance of the council. One, because of its constraint on growth, and two, because it will have a financial implication, both in terms of IGC growth that you wouldn't get, and secondly in terms of the capex that will be required to try and catch up.
Yes, although with separation, that the council group will be isolated a bit from those debt and revenue impacts, because it's now we look at separately from a rating perspective. But yes, those could be significant issues and impacts. Water care are busy working on their business plan and AMP to feed into the new regulatory environment. I haven't had any indications yet around whether those constraints, whether they're starting to think differently about their AMP. So I think that's something we'd have to address those questions to Watercare, just thinking, is their thinking, is their planning changing, shifting as a result of those things? So I think that's something we would have to direct those questions to Watercare.
My final question, Your Worship, on a different matter. I received advice from staff this morning, the memo in relation to local board cost budget pressures, and I'm just wondering at what point are we able to have a discussion about that? And it might, appreciate it's not going to be here, but I think that this is a matter for some whole of council resolution in relation to how we're going to approach budget pressures at local board in relation to fairer funding, because I don't want to vote for a budget that doesn't, in principle and in application, make good on what we resolve to do prior to 1 July. I want us to give effect to fairer funding, but what I'm seeing from advice from officers is that this will all have to be a matter for some reconsideration with local boards affected. If there has to be a reallocation, I'd like us to do that and to carve out fairer funding as a matter that we're not going to walk back.
Yeah, so I mean, our current plan is to work through that. These cost pressures are still changing and evolving, and we'll get more information through February. So our plan was to take that to the political working group and bring it back to the budget committee in the new year. In February, we have heard from local boards this week that there is concern in that space, and people want a bit more information. We'd like to understand the issues a bit sooner in terms of informing consultation. So we're looking to see what information we can put out and provide. That will have to be the draft information what we've got at the moment. There's no intention to change the policy principles. It's about implementing direction through the long-term plan. Without getting into the issue too much, the intention was, how do we make the funding fairer, making no one worse off, but we move to a more equitable place. The making no one work off was based off a set of costs of delivering services. Those costs have changed as some of the trends, electricity prices, living wage, etc. The costs are shifting, so we're kind of dealing with what does that mean. So what does it mean for, we're giving local boards this control discretion around the full asset-based costs of running their services. When those costs shift, how does that work? What does it mean? What's the intersection with this transition? So it's some complex pieces here. We will provide some more information, and we can work through to find out, is there an opportunity to have a budget committee discussion at an appropriate time. We'll work with the political working group to make sure we can work through these complex issues. Well, we can have a discussion around doing that a little bit sooner if we can make the time work. We're happy to provide information. We'll have better information in February, but I do acknowledge that some boards have got some concerns now and would want to have a bit more information ahead of consultation. So we'll see what we can do.
Councillor Ferry, please.
Thank you. I won't speak later, so just a short shout out for the grad program. We have a number of grads who end up supporting us as they rotate through the grad program, and a number of them have then come back and got jobs supporting us and doing a great job. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to, as council support advisors and then elsewhere in the governance team. So yay for them. My question though, and I'm probably asking this today, expecting an answer perhaps when we get that more comprehensive Recovery Office report next week, is I'd like to understand the consequential OPEX implications of more Category 3 purchases. So if we can either, I don't know if there's a quick answer now, but I would really appreciate that coming in the information next week, because I'm quite worried about that aspect of it. Particularly, we're likely to have increased maintenance of these sites purely because there are more of them, and also because it will take more time to clear more sites, that kind of thing. So that's something I'd like to understand better today, if there's a brief answer, but otherwise in the information coming next week. Thanks.
I think for the purposes of today, acknowledge the question and very much acknowledge that there is a consequential OPEX question mark here. We'll seek to address it to some degree next week. I also draw your attention to, I think we're on a February timeline to report back on how we're going to treat the residual land post the buyouts. So it's tied up with that in terms of what the profile of that land looks like as well. So it might come in two parts.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Councillor Leone, please.
Oh, kia ora. Congratulations on the work that you're doing in terms of the cost savings. My questions are just around the debt. Just wanting to get an update now with the debt separation, what our percentage is, and also with obviously the interest rates coming down, does that mean that the debt that we do have, some of those payments are envisaged to reduce, and would any of those have significant impact with our annual plan?
So with the the debt projections and the water care separation is also built into the long-term plan projections. So we are, we're basically generally tracking against that. We are seeing, so in the long-term plan we expected interest rates to come down. Gary and fellow economists are pretty good at predicting where rates go, and we've built that into the forecasts. There's a little bit of benefit in terms of interest rates being slightly below the projections, and it's helped mitigating some of the pressures, but it's not a lot, and we do lock in a lot of our interest costs. So so basically the big structural changes for water care are projected in, the general trend is projected in, so things are generally tracking in line with the long-term plan. Don't have the current percentage debt to revenue for October, but it is in the report for the September quarter, which is the next item on the agenda, and so it'll be covered there.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Lee, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have two questions, one relating to item 5 and one relating to item 11, and I'll start off with item 11, economic market update. And the figures you've given us here indicate that the country and the city, I guess the region, is experiencing quite serious economic difficulties. It's a timely reminder because I think inside Auckland Council world, we can tend to live somewhat in a bubble. Our indicators always go up, our rates go up, our charges go up. Auckland transport charges, public transport charges go up, but behind these figures, there are real people who must be struggling right now. So I'll make the point that just about all of these figures don't directly relate to Auckland or Auckland Council, but we are responsible for a third of the country, so perhaps we are involved in this. I note that economic development is a point of consideration as part of CCO reform, the Mayor's CCO reforms, and I was struck by the references I read or hear from council officers talking about the responsibility for delivering economic development, which is an interesting concept. But obviously, more of it needs to be delivered by someone. Anyway, the question is, noting the international migration figures, 178,000 arrivals and 133,000 departures with a net gain of 44,900. I take it from the wording, unlike most of the figures, this is not relating to Auckland itself. They're national figures, right?
Thank you for your question, Councillor. That's correct. National figures, and Auckland's typically accounted for somewhere between a third and a half of that net gain, if we look back over the last...
So it'd be good to put the actual Auckland component. And the other one is, I said that Auckland Council is not really responsible for the situation, but it must have some involvement given its size and the size of Auckland. But one thing I think Auckland Council is directly responsible for, in my view, is the city centre pedestrian counts for October 2024, which were down 3.2% compared to October 2023. What I would like to see, if possible, the figures for city centre pedestrian counts prior to the COVID pandemic. So the 2019 figures should be the benchmark. It's something that needs to apply also to Auckland Transport's difficulties in terms of public transport. Auckland Transport has fallen off the pace in delivering public transport compared to the situation in 2019. So it would be good for us to give some serious consideration to what I believe the Auckland Council Group is delivering to the city centre, and I ain't good. Next question, and it's to the Chief Executive, and it relates to potential financial risks, which you have addressed. I am interested to know, in terms of financial risk and risks to reputation, both in the marketplace and in the community, about the funding agreements that you, as the duly authorised Chief Executive Officer, have signed off in June relating to the St James Theatre. Why is this being delayed? Because I've heard different things which seem to be a matter of detail that could easily be cleared up with good faith. But what is happening is that people are asking me, the local member of parliament, the developer, other people in the community, and there's a curtain of silence about this, and I think we need to have an answer. Mr. Wilson, you're the guy who signed off, and I want to hear from you whether you consider we are at some risks, reputational risk and financial risk, liability risk, and letting a developer sit there month after month, according to him, costing his company $250,000 a month, and yet there's no clear communication about when this deal will be honoured.
Well, there's a number of questions there. Some of the early ones are for the chief economist, and a bit towards the end, Oliver, go to answering that.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you, Councillor Lee. You've commented about pedestrian counts being benchmarked pre-pandemic. We have a short note that we've prepared to release, but we can make that available to councillors very shortly ahead of release. If you'd like to see some of that analysis, it's almost ready to go. We'll get that to you.
But all due respect, my question was for the Chief Executive Officer. Thank you for that. Thank you for your help.
Now, the St James thing, that's been fended off for a wee bit.
Excuse me, Mr Mayor, you're not the Chief Executive Officer, please.
Sorry, I thought, well, I'll let the Chief Executive Officer, he'll know exactly what the answer is for that. Cheers. Sorry, you were looking at me and you said, it's you, and I thought you meant me. Yeah, for a moment my pay went up, but...
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lee. Just for the benefit of other councillors, Councillor Lee's correct. I did sign an agreement in line with earlier direction around the St James project when I considered that certain things had been satisfied that were set down as prerequisites from yourselves. True. And insofar as there has been some delay in executing that, I think there is at least potentially a reputational risk, but one that we're attempting to manage by having the right communication with those stakeholders. Probably he is not the forum to talk about whether there is legal liability or risk in that regard, but I do acknowledge that, I do acknowledge your point in that regard. My understanding is that the delay is for a good reason, insofar as there are other considerations such as the Queen Street frontage for that site and whether there are additional things that I potentially should have taken into account. Certainly that there's a sense that you should be availed of some advice around other related aspects of that project. I probably can't speak more to it.
Can I say the Queen Street frontage is certainly a valid concern, but it's not part of the deal. However, the developer has said time and again, he can sort that if you want, but why the hold-up? And obviously, you're in a difficult situation, Mr. Wilson, but I think the public's patience is running out. You know, I often cite the Local Government Act when it comes to decision-making, the things we should do, but arbitrariness and a code of sort of silence around decisions, which are of high public interest and support, is certainly not enabled in the Local Government Act, quite the opposite.
Okay, that was a question, I believe, but Councillor Foley, are you there this time?
Yes. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, good on you.
Thank you. My apologies. My internet's not great, so I've fallen on and off. My questions are very quick, and they're to our CEO as well, Phil, please. Congratulations as well, first, for all of the hard work that you and your team are doing in terms of the savings especially. My questions are about the graduate program, and you may be able to answer it now or later, which is fine. First off, do you have stats around the percentage of the graduates who are Māori, Pasifika or female? Second, do you have stats on the percentage of the graduates that do then actually go on to gain employment at council? And then lastly, an ask from me, when you do go out for the next recruitment round, if you could send a link to us as councillors so that we can share them with our communities and networks as well. Kia ora.
Talofa, Councillor. It's in simple terms, yes and yes and yes. We do have those statistics. I don't have them in front of me, but can be shared afterwards. We do understand what hit rate we've had in terms of moving graduates into permanent employment historically. And I'm very happy to share with you any recruitment material that you can take advantage of in terms of sharing the opportunity with your networks. Welcome that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
For that question, Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you. And to the question about economy before, I think you mentioned Takapuna, Mayor. It's actually 12.9, not 9 increase. And to your question, Deputy Mayor, Newmarket was down 9.6 on this time last year. So there's quite a wide spread of ranges, but most areas are down, unfortunately. On the figures for unemployment, so if I think lost about 40,000 jobs countrywide in the last 6 months, how are we tracking, or do you know how we're tracking for Auckland? Because I know through the GFC, Auckland was sort of far worse than the rest of the country, especially on youth unemployment. Are we looking at the data across there?
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. The national unemployment rate, the most recent quarter, I think it's Q3, is 4.8%. And I think Auckland, from memory, is very close to that. So as a percentage rate, not too different at this point. But you're right that youth unemployment tends to be higher and be a bit more persistent when we come out of such downturns.
Thank you. And the monetary policy statement yesterday does say we're going to be in the country, I guess, but hopefully not. But looks like we're going to be in more pain for longer than expected. Are we also looking at how that affects our infrastructure and other parts of the organisation? So I don't know if Phil or others have been looking at how we are able to get things done. You know, is it affecting what we need to do as well as the broader economy? Because it does seem like the slowdown of house consents building, the effects on GDP are sort of greater, and also the numbers of people leaving. Skilled labour is leaving quicker than expected. Are we looking at anything we need to do to help the city?
Well, if I could just comment briefly in response and perhaps hand to others who may have further perspectives, but thank you, Councillor. I think with respect to infrastructure, so much of it is long-lived, and we're really building for the medium to long term, and often we're very much in the moment thinking about the fluctuations that we face, whether we're on the down or on the up. And we're at the moment, we're sort of coming hopefully to the end of quite a long downturn. And so I think we've got to be careful about not overweighting where we are in the moment through these cycles that do fluctuate. And when it comes to delivering infrastructure, we've got to keep our minds on the medium term and that 10-year horizon, certainly for the long-term plan. But others may wish to jump in.
My go at this, Councillor, is to say the principal discussion we're having that I think is useful is about getting as much long-run certainty as we can about the capital program and the project, you know, the program of work that sits there, and not just the very big infrastructure projects, but also the program, you know, that community facilities has at a more local level, for example. The key thing for the contractors is to have continuity of work, or at least a reasonable assurance that there's a pipeline there that enables them to make the investments in their workforce and to hang on to people, because there's not reassurance that there will definitely be work, but enough assurance that there's a pipeline of work. So that's where a lot of the discussion is, that has a bearing on retaining skills at an industry level.
And two more questions. One is on the water care, the red zoning. You know, when I was getting questions about that about a month ago of maps and things getting out there, I went obviously to yourself and Megan and Watercare about that, and that's part of the reason why it was released. I guess long term, with them slightly further separated from us, how will we ensure this type of thing doesn't happen again, or there's ability for us to be updated in a confidential way? So we, you know, I was briefed on the morning before it was released out, but most of us didn't have information. And I think when we are thinking of the DC infrastructure related and this infrastructure, how do we ensure that we're able to bring all that together? Or maybe it's your discussion with the CEOs, just to, not saying that we need special treatment, but we do need the lines to allay fears, or to make sure people understand all at the same time, as opposed to sort of a patchwork way of getting things.
Look, I think that's an entirely reasonable observation and request. It has been raised. I acknowledge that issues been raised with me offline by some other councillors, that there wasn't sufficient briefing advice about what was going to be said and when was it going to be in the public arena. So I think I will work with my colleagues to make sure that that is improved.
And the last question, just on the pedestrian count, are we able to have a bit of a review of what it's actually measuring and not measuring? And if we're only going to use pre-COVID, you know, some of the discussion last time was actually the pedestrian counts, some are broken, or we do have put some others in that weren't in before COVID. And the fact is, Commercial Bay and big tranches of Wynyard Quarter weren't open before COVID, 2019. I mean, Commercial Bay opened 2021, I think. So you've got thousands of people working different parts of the city that aren't being measured. And I just want to maybe how we can refocus and look at what, you know, if people are traveling in a different way or walking, you know, I catch my bus down at Key Street and it's pretty busy down there every day, but I know we're not counting most of that area. So if we're just counting Midtown forever when things have moved around the city, it would be good just to review what that's actually telling us. I know that some of those buildings are filling up. We've got very low occupancy, low vacancies now in the office space, commercial space, compared to pre-COVID. So it'd just be good to have a bit of an understanding of, are they the right places still?
Thank you, Councillor. I think that's consistent with the earlier question from Councillor Simpson. You want a bit more context in the reports? We have been quite careful to use a sample of cameras that have been running the whole time from pre-pandemic to now. That was very much in the context of how we comparing now to pre-pandemic, but you're right, there are a wider set of cameras now, and we can look at that too. So we'll put some effort in to make sure that that information has got context around it and that it's visible to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's possibly why I've asked for the centric stuff, to give you a bit of a view. Pedestrian counts can also be mucked up by somebody doing some work on one side of the street. And moving and seconding that, I think Councillor Sayers wants to move that. I'm happy to second that. You guys retire in case there's a bit of debate that we haven't covered. Any people got their hands up for debate of this? Some of those questions sounded quite debateful, but in that case, I shall put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, carried. It's now 12:35. We'll break till 1:05 for lunch. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.